I want to talk about God. Anytime I hear the word God, I immediately feel afraid. And I think most people do too. And they hear, I think what they hear is some damning fire and brimstone, I'm going to hurt you if you make a mistake, stuff that comes out of really the last 12 books of the Old Testament, called the Minor Prophets, and then also Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah. That's what everybody's scared of. But that's not what I want to talk about. Because I got that fear in me too. But that fear is not God. On page 12 of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the most important set of freedom that we will ever have as 12-steppers given to us. It says simply, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And we can do that. Now, one of the things I've learned as a child was never let, when it comes to higher powers, don't let anybody ever be one. One of the things I also learned is that until you're 14 as a human being, your higher power as a human animal is your mother or your father. And unless your mother and father were perfect, and they weren't, then there's a reason, then you got hurt sometimes, even by accident. And so human beings, we fear that. And so when it comes time, later in our lives, in our 20s and 30s, when we look at the question of God, the feeling is fear. But that feeling is not God. That feeling is not legitimately about God. God's actually getting blamed for something that he had nothing to do with. It's about childhood and about imperfect raising of children. That's what it's about. So when I come to the question of God, and my initial reaction is fear, that is prejudice. I have prejudged the situation, and I don't want to do that. For me, in my story about God, when I first came to 12-step, what I had was kind of a version. It was kind of like Jesus, but Jesus would let me have committed monogamy, and I didn't have to marry somebody to have sex. And also, Jesus was okay with profanity and obscenity, kind of like Richard Pryor meets Jesus. It was a very helpful God, and that worked for me for a long time. And then what happens, I lost custody of my daughter for 3 years. And when that happened, I went into the darkest stages of my life. I went into 3 years. I wasn't depressed, but I was incredibly challenged because I knew I wanted to stay sober, and I knew to do that, I had to have some form of God. So I pared it down to something really simple, G-O-D, good orderly direction. And I would just go to meetings, and I would write steps, and I'd call people on the phone, and sponsor people, and anything that I was told to do. I had smart feet, G-O-D, and that got me through for a number of years. And then I joined Food Addicts Anonymous. And what happened was something I had in my head since '97 came to fruition 10 years later. Gandhi had an admonition. He says, complete control of the palate made observance of the vow of celibacy very easy. Now, it's not easy. Celibacy for me is a struggle daily, every day of my life. But controlling the food, the palate, makes that easier. And when I got to FA, where they weighed and measured food and wouldn't let me have flour or sugar, my lust diminished greatly. And when that happened, I could find my way into the Christian church, which I had never been able to do. I was never able to do that until I was 52. And for a number of years, that part of God worked for me. It worked for me. It wasn't me, it wasn't the church that was the problem all along. It was me. I couldn't abide by the rules because I didn't have the tools. I was powerless in an area. And so that worked fine for me. So that's my trajectory in the last 24 years of how my relationship with God has changed 3 times. Because I take what it says on page 12 of the big book very seriously. Why don't you choose your own conception? So 3 times I've had 3 choices about God, and that's worked for me. That's my right as a 12-step, to define God how I want to, what works for me. The last thing I want to say about God is through all those things, there's been a part of God that's been quite different from either of those 3 conceptions. And that's the God in community. The God that's not about me, and it's not about you, but it's about us. That shows up. I can't create that part of God, and you can't. But when 2 of us show up, there's a synergistic energy that happens that's greater than me and greater than you. The Christians call it the Holy Spirit. The 12-steppers call it God in community. The 12-steppers call it higher power. It's a power of community. It's the God of the group. And when I most experience that is when I'm helping another addict get well. When that happens, that part of God shows up, and that always works. And that I have a right as a 12-stepper to choose. So those have been my 4 conceptions. And the belief about God is crucial. And the most important thing about it is I have the right to choose. When Jesus was doing his healing, only thing he would say is your faith or your belief has healed you. So my belief can heal me or harm me, and it's completely in my control. I can choose whatever I want. And I've chosen 4 different ways in the last 24 years to conceive God so that it worked in my life. And that's your right and your prerogative as a 12-stepper. It's your heritage.